They said the masters kept kitchens full of citrus and cedar, that the estate smelled of hearth and order, but the air that crept out from behind the servants' quarters tasted of rust and salt. A child sat on the cold flagstones, knees drawn to a chest that was too heavy for her small hands, while women in embroidered aprons smoothed the seams of a dress meant to display her and not to warm her. She was introduced to guests as an ornament. They called her Naomi. Her voice was a bell broken by handling. The lamps threw long, deliberate shadows across the courtyard, and the laughter at the table had a ceremonial calm that hid a ledger of names. To understand why a place of gentility became a machine of ownership, we must unpick the ceremonies, read the registers that no guide mentions, and listen to the confession someone left in a note sewn into a mattress. If you want to follow this thread of truth with us, subscribe and help us bring these forgotten voices to light. Now we go back to where the habit of ownership began, and to the head who taught others to look at bodies as less than human. He was born in a caravan town that served caravans just long enough to learn how to calculate value. As a boy, he watched ledgers and marriage contracts exchanged like bread. His childhood taught him trade and the thousand small courtesies of ranking. The second paragraph of his life began under the tutelage of Magistrate Alvar, who taught him law and the vocabulary of order. He read codes that turned people into property, clauses that reduced lives to lines in a document, and he learned to write in the hand of authority. The third paragraph came with a marriage into wealth that elevated him from clerk to manager of a provincial house of the empire. The fourth paragraph arrived as loss, when the river fever took his first child, and with that grief came the belief that control over life answered the chaos of mortality. Early service and the rituals of presentation refined him into a leader who equated visibility with legitimacy. He took the title of master, and the populace called him benefactor as parades passed his gate. High Priestess Senna attended his investiture and pronounced his house sanctified. Scribe Juno recorded honors that doubled as ownership documents. Surgeon Mali wrote certificates that were later filed away. Captain Romas oversaw the guards who kept order at the thresholds. Mistress Varia arranged the guests and the concubines. Guard Orin carried messages sealed with wax. Archaeologist Dr. Hayes would much later read those seals as if they were bones. These names circled his ascent, each acting with small decisions that compounded into systemic ritual. The first breaches came when public charity masked private appropriation. A widow was given shelter, and her son was listed as an apprentice, yet the apprentice registry soon included payments that never existed. The populace applauded a festival, while Naomi at the courtyard edge learned the weight of a bell that summoned for service. She heard coin clatter like rain and felt the scratch of coarse linen against her skin. The master spoke in a voice that was both warm and precise. In a chamber where officials filed minutes, a conversation unfolded. "Why is her name not in the list of servants?" asked Scribe Juno with a pen trembling over paper. "She belongs to the house, not to the list," answered the master, the words soft as velvet and heavy as stone. "That is not lawful," said Magistrate Alvar, tapping the table where ledgers lay open. "The law recognizes property," said Captain Romas, looking at the doorway as if the law was another guard on duty. "And what happens when the property refuses?" asked Surgeon Mali in a voice lowered to the pitch of a whisper. "Then the estate corrects itself," said the master without smiling. They spoke with manners. The light in the room smelled faintly of oil and citrus. Metal clicked as seals were prepared. The air tasted of stale wine and the salt of sweat. A curtain brushed skin, the floor felt cold under bare feet, and there was a metallic aftertaste in the words that named ownership. The first punishments were small and public enough to teach obedience. A young man who refused an order had his bread withheld at dawn. A midwife who documented an irregularity found her tools confiscated and her name erased from the registry. News of a failed complaint spread through the market like a bruised fruit smell that told vendors to avert their eyes. Rituals of contrition were staged beneath banners and incense. The empire took the language of mercy and turned it into a ledger. Then a campaign came that humbled the house and set the master on a different course. Forces from a neighboring province marched past the gates and returned with trophies and a rumor of shame. The master led a brigade to the frontier, believing glory would cement his legitimacy. He returned with a wounded pride and no parade. In the field, he tasted dust and iron. He heard the call of trumpets that once assured him of victory, now sounding distant and corrupt. The soldiers told stories to avoid looking at their chiefs, and the master retreated into private ritual. He began to read confessions not as contrition but as sources of control. Sensory memory hardened into new habits. He walked the house at night, feeling the cool marble underfoot, smelling the torches, listening for breathing that might betray secret sympathy, and tasting ash over his tongue when tragedies were reported. This period was a turning point. Reports from Captain Romas were circumspect. Surgeon Mali started to keep separate notes. Mistress Varya learned to move the young ones like pieces on a board. Naomi learned to read the small rebellions in others' eyes and to measure them like breaths. There followed a wave of arbitrary sentences signed by Magistrate Alvar, each paper folded and filed away by Scribe Juno. The rituals moved from punishment into administration. Prison became not a moment, but a department. The household built forms that allowed owners to allocate labor, to catalog bodies into the estate account books, to issue custody orders that smelled of ink and damp paper. Inside the house, a system formed that had its own vocabulary and its own officers. The harem was a term invoked in polite company to suggest elegance. In practice, the room behind the altar served as registry, a place where the master received petitions and where the concubines were cataloged according to the market value assigned by clerks. There were daily audits where names were checked, weights measured, and quotas set. A ledger listed the number of people used for display, for labor, for breeding, and for exchange. The sense of food prepared for guests contrasted with the stenches from the laundry pits. The soundscape contained clinking cups, whispered corrections, a distant loom, and the muffled sob of someone dragged from sleep. Tactile textures varied from silk to rope. A guard would test a rope with fingers calloused by duty and taste the iron of coin at the end of transactions. The bureaucracy of control relied on a magistrate, a priestly endorsement, medical certificates that justified decisions, and a catalog of behaviors that could be used as pretexts. The complicity was not just bureaucratic, it was social. High Priestess Sena proclaimed rituals that sanctified the division. Surgeon Mali wrote reports that labeled stubbornness a condition requiring custody. Scribe Juno falsified entries to match public accounts. Captain Romas enforced quotas with a ledger in his breast pocket. Mistress Varya arranged marriages and displays in ways that made exploitation seem like tradition. Guard Orin obscured movements and passed messages between officials with a nod. Magistrate Alvar signed verdicts and never asked who paid, only who benefited. Their motives varied. Some sought favor, others feared revenue loss, some believed in an ideology that equated order with moral good. The system replaced individual choice with procedure, and the procedure became sacred. Tension rose in moments that pierced the calm with violence. In one night, Naomi found a hidden stack of letters in a mattress seam and read pleas scratched in charcoal. The discovery smelled of stale ink and dust. Her hands trembled, a papery scrape echoing in a silent room. She thought of burning the notes and then of leaving them where they were, a witness. She pushed her face into the cloth and tasted the faint sweetness of old wine on the papers. The choice before her felt like the rustle before a storm. Another moment occurred when a rebel returned to the courtyard and accused Captain Romas of using excess force. The street noise ceased as if the city itself were pressing to hear. Voices rose and fell like waves. The guard's boots sounded like a heartbeat. The master put his hand to his chest, and the tremor in that gesture spoke more than any decree. A sealed box was presented as evidence, and a ritual of apology performed that stung like salt on a wound. A third moment was the arrest of Surgeon Mali when a patient died and the official record named death as natural. Mali protested in a corridor that smelled of disinfectant and lemon oil. He slammed his palm on the table. His breath was hot. The master watched with a face carved from marble. The room tasted of iron, and the small sounds of paper being stacked underlined the finality. A fourth rupture happened when a procession for a public benefaction hid the removal of children to a distant estate. The crowd cheered, and the music masked the rhythm of distraught feet leaving. Someone in the back of the crowd smelled the char of a candle that had been blown out too quickly. That scent braided with a metallic hint like an omen. Plots to end the master began as whispers in the tavern and as notes passed under doors. A group that included Scribe Juno, Captain Romas, and a dismissed foreman named Malik concocted a plan that depended on timing and the master's confidence in ceremony. They met in the cellar under the bakery where the air was warm and yeasty and their voices were low. "Once the magistrate is at the temple, we move," said Malik, clenching a bread crust until salt granules fell. "The priestess will be distracted by the festival rites," murmured Scribe Juno, smoothing a folded list of names. "You will open the gate," said Captain Romas, tasting the iron rim of the key he still carried. "Who will speak for the people?" asked a woman named Alia with a threat of fear in her tone. "I will," said Scribe Juno finally, and the word fell like a bell being struck. The assassination unfolded during a ceremony that should have celebrated harvest. The master stood at the altar with gold leaf catching the sun, the smell of incense thick and almost medicinal. The conspirators moved like shadows rehearsed through the night, each touch mapped and each sound accounted for. The final approach was quiet enough to make the marble seem soft. The master felt a presence and reached out. His last perception was of silk slipping through fingers, the slight chemical tang of an oil applied with intent, the thud of a fall that sounded like a book closing, and the sudden loudness of a world that had been waiting to breathe. The exchanges in the moments after the act were sparse and severe. "Was it done?" asked Captain Romas, speaking into the hush. "It is done," answered Scribe Juno, his voice a broken instrument. "Seal the records," ordered Malik with a tone that tasted like ash. "Who will take the altar?" asked Alia while her hands were still cold. "We will bury the ledger where no one looks," said Captain Romas, and the words slid into the damp earth with a finality that tasted of iron. Afterwards, the public story was tidy. The master had died in his bed or by accident, depending on the official list. The elite stitched versions that reassured the populace. High Priestess Senna delivered a sermon that smelled of rose and smoke, while papers went into boxes labeled with euphemisms. The bodies and the evidence were arranged to match the new narrative, and the concubines were moved between houses as if furniture. Centuries later, archaeologists lifted slabs of stone in a courtyard that no map marked as anything other than ornamental garden. Dr. Hayes and a small team found a pit of disarticulated items, bone fragments, jars with labels that matched names in an old ledger, and seals with wax that preserved trace chemicals. The dirt under the stones smelled of centuries and of the citrus once used to mask scent. Forensic analysis revealed cut marks consistent with bindings, traces of chemicals used to numb, and fragments of fabric that matched descriptions in private letters. A confessional note sewn into a mattress was carbon dated to the period and matched handwriting found in the magistrate registers. The forensic report quoted a pathologist who said that the patterns were not accidental, and that the administrative records intentionally omitted incidents in exchange for tax credits. A cultural historian compared the ritualized language to other sites where bureaucratic euphemism served to justify exploitation. The uncovering forced institutions to respond. Courts reopened cases, and names long honored on public squares were removed. Museums reinterpreted exhibits. Families discovered that their ancestors had been benefactors built on stolen labor. The public reaction mixed shame and disbelief. Some defended the past by insisting on context, while others demanded reparatory action. The raw evidence made myth-takers of many. 1 month after the publication of the findings, a committee convened, and the first steps were symbolic. A plaque was placed near the excavation site acknowledging victims, and a fund was created for descendants. The city smelled of wet stone and fresh paint as volunteers cleaned the garden. Naomi's name was read aloud in a small ceremony. People touched the plaque like a new part of their map, and the air tasted of tears and metal. 3 months later, reforms had a bureaucratic order. Records unsealed in the archives required reclassification of property law. Magistrate Alvar's name was stripped from a scholarship. Surgeon Mali was posthumously exonerated. The process was formal and the colors were lighter. Public debates raged in the markets and in the press. The press printed lists of names, and the sound of their arguments made the corners of buildings hum. Families that had benefited resisted, but some turned to apology and restitution. The memory of the courtyard and the scent of citrus became contested again, but now as a symbol of what had been hidden. 6 months out, the landscape of memory had shifted more permanently. Museums rewritten their placards, and school curricula included sections on how administrative language could hide abuse. Grants supported further digs led by Dr. Hayes and teams trained in forensic anthropology. Descendant groups received stipends, and some estates offered land for memorial gardens. The economy adjusted with legal cases and compensations. A new ritual emerged on the anniversary of the excavation, where citizens gathered to read the names recovered from the pit and to leave small offerings. That ritual smelled of bread and citrus and of rosemary. It tasted like a pledge to remember. The evidence did not undo the harm, but it reframed who was held accountable. The confessions, once sewn into mattresses, had been corroborated by bones and by ledgers, and the public record was forced to alter its story. If monuments had been built on silence, the excavation pried open that silence and let the names return. Share this investigation so others will learn that history is not only what triumphal stones tell us, but also what the dust and the bones have been waiting to say. Remember that civility can be a veil over cruelty, and that the smallest ledger line can hide a life.